Presentation of Dialogue on Idaho Public Television is made possible through the generous support of the Laura Moore Cunningham Foundation, committed to fulfilling the Moore and Bettis family legacy of building the great state of Idaho. By the Friends of Idaho Public Television and by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.
He is not a traitor. He did not go looking for the Taliban. There's no evidence for either of those charges. And while he was in captivity, he never stopped trying to escape.
Coming up, it's still one of the most controversial stories in American history. Why did Idahoan Bowe Bergdahl walk away from his Army base in Afghanistan, and what effect did that have on his compatriots and his country? I talk with a former Idaho reporter who's written a book about Bergdahl and how the search for him became entangled with U.S. foreign policy. That's Dialogue next. Stay tuned. Hello and welcome to Dialogue. I'm Marcia Franklin. My guest today was a reporter in Ketchum, Idaho, when U.S. Army Sergeant Bowe Bergdahl walked away from his base in Afghanistan in June of 2009. Bergdahl, who was raised outside of Haley, Idaho, was almost immediately captured by the Taliban. He was held hostage for almost 5 years and during that time was tortured. On May 31, 2014, President Obama announced that Bergdahl had been released. The U.S. government also transferred 5 detainees out of the prison at Guantanamo Bay in Cuba. Ultimately, Bergdahl pled guilty to a charge of desertion and misbehavior before the enemy. He received a dishonorable discharge and had his rank reduced from sergeant to private. Reporters Michael Ames and Matt Farwell took a deeper dive into what happened in their book, American Cipher, Bowe Bergdahl and the U.S. Tragedy in Afghanistan. I talked with Michael Ames to find out more. Well, welcome to Idaho, or I should say welcome back to Idaho, because you lived here for 9 years, up in the Wood River Valley.
Yes.
Working on a magazine. So that's obviously how you came to know about this story, because I think Bowe Bergdahl's father was your UPS driver for...
That's right, in Haley.
The magazine you worked at?
Yes.
That's amazing. And didn't I read in your book that his father continued his UPS route that day?
Oh yeah, the day he found out, right. His parents were notified earlier than the rest of us were, and Bob continued delivering packages and coming to the office, and he continued his route for years.
Wow.
Yeah.
Do you remember how you felt knowing that a local, person had been captured and you're in the media?
Sure. I mean, the war had seemed so distant for so long, and then to all of a sudden have it come home in this very, very blunt way and unmistakable way and emotional way. I mean, this was our UPS driver's son, and you could see the pain and worry in his eyes every day as he tried to be polite and make small talk, but there was no mistaking what was going on. And as the years went on, I mean, at one point, Bob, in the middle of a snowstorm, needed to use a landline because he was receiving messages from someone back in Washington, and overhearing a little bit of that conversation really brought home just what he had and his family had become ensnared in, which also for the town brought the war home in a way. You
were not reporting on it, or were you reporting on it?
No.
Your magazine was kind of out of the fray, so to speak.
It was a lifestyle magazine. We were focusing on mountain biking and local foods, and so yeah, I wasn't a political journalist at the time.
Well, you left in, 2011 while he was still captive.
Yes.
But obviously the story stuck with you. Why did you want to write the book? I know part of it was your sense that it really hadn't been covered correctly, including the effect that it had on community members who you knew.
Right, and I think that was the first thing. I mean, there were 2 things that struck me right away. One was that it didn't seem that the stories we were being told on political cable news shows were accurate. They were more sensational than they were invested in the facts. And also because I was watching what was happening back in my home away from home, where I had lived for so long in the Wood River Valley, and seeing people I knew and friends of mine receive death threats. And I was outraged by how the media was facilitating this climate of hate in a small town that's a very peaceful, tight-knit and supportive community.
Now, a lot of people have obviously heard about this story. It was international news. What did you and your co-author, and we'll talk about him in a moment, what did you and your co-author feel you could contribute more to the story?
Well, we each had our personal ties to it. My co-author, Matt Farwell, fought in Afghanistan in the same province that Bo did 2 years before Bo was there, so he knew what the war looked like up close and personal. And I lived in the community that was impacted. So we each had a lot of personal investment to tell the story and what the war does to American military families and what this episode did to families and the community in Haley.
How did you meet your co-author?
Well, he was reporting on it. He was the first person reporting on it, really, when he came back from Afghanistan. He was researching why would a soldier from Idaho walk off his base in one of the most dangerous combat zones in the country. And that fascinated him. And he started looking into it, and then he reported, along with the late Rolling Stone reporter Michael Hastings, on the first large investigation of the story in 2012 for Rolling Stone. And then my reporting for Newsweek 3 years later was sort of the next deep investigation, so we kind of bookended it. We found each other.
No pun intended.
Yes, and we teamed up. And I knew the valley so well, so I could tell where Bo came from. And I could talk about how this was an Idaho story in many ways. I mean, Bo Bergdahl grew up in a very unique way, in a very unique place, miles out a desert canyon that 98%, 99% of Americans would have a hard time even understanding what that looks like. You know, and when Bo was recovered, and everyone remembers the footage of seeing him walk towards that helicopter, I remember thinking that day, well, that looks an awful lot like the Wood River Valley. And the topography and the climate looked similar. And it immediately sort of explained to me how an eccentric, idealistic young man could think that he could go walking 19 miles through the Afghan desert, because he would walk 19 miles through the Idaho desert frequently.
He grew up in quite a religious household, Calvinistic, as you put it, and also was homeschooled for a time, yes?
Yes.
So these all, plus he grew up with a certain type of personality. So all these kind of fed into a sum total of a young man who, in many ways, was divorced for a long time from regular society.
I think that's fair, right. And he grew up in one of the most beautiful places you could imagine, but it was also a very isolated place. The house, when they first moved in and Bo was born, they were sharing the home, which Bob and Jenny built themselves. They were sharing it with their horses. It was a barn/house. They were living in rural Idaho. And Bo grew up in the backcountry, and he grew up learning how to shoot from a very young age. He could handle a .22 by the time he was 5 years old. And between the church and the discipline and the homeschooling, I think he was a bit removed from society and sort of some of the give and take that we all know we have to do with people and authority figures who we might not always agree with. And of course, in the Army, that's going to create some problems.
And I was unfamiliar with the strict way that his dad was with him, something that Bo would talk about later in the interviews that he did with the military officers debriefing him. Do you think it was abusive?
I don't think it's my place to define that, but I can tell you what the Army psychiatrist said, which is that Bo perceived parts of his upbringing as abusive, and it was his perception that really mattered. And that certainly shaped his childhood in many ways. And he was also exceptionally headstrong, and his parents told me that. He was a kid who told his parents that he didn't want to sleep on a mattress, which is a fairly unusual thing for a teenager to say. And he was going to do things his way. And when he decided to enlist in the military, which he did twice, which 99% of Americans have not volunteered twice for military service, I think he butted up very quickly against that tension between both wanting to be an exemplary soldier, or when he first enlisted it was in the Coast Guard, and between holding on to his own identity in headstrong ways, which is not going to work very well in the military.
And we should say before we go any further that because you did an explication of his life, his childhood, you're not in any way excusing the behavior that happened.
No, certainly not. And I think it's important to say that for people who, we really encourage people who are skeptical about the Bowe Bergdahl story to give our book a try, because we're not defending his actions. They're indefensible. You don't walk away from a post in a combat zone, period. However, in context, the story tells a lot about this war and about what American foreign policy, with its own idealism and wants for adventure, have stumbled into in a way that Bowe Bergdahl stumbled into his own misadventure.
Well, your book alternates between the story of Bowe Bergdahl and the story of the war and the nexus between them. And it really highlights the disorganization in the military in dealing with this situation. You call it a hydra-headed disarray. Why was it so important for you to talk about the war and the kind of political machinations in addition to Bowe's story?
There is no better lens to which to understand the greater war and the conflict there and America's quagmire there than Bowe's story. It's a perfect illustration. In some ways it parallels our own. Like I was saying, his idealism is somewhat mirrored by Washington's idealism and delusions, and also because of the fundamental cover-ups of the war that we were not told in the American public. Pakistan was our number one ally in this war, and yet Bowe Bergdahl was smuggled over the border to Pakistan within days of his abduction, which was a fact and a piece of intelligence that was not just ignored, it was suppressed in the Army chain of command.
And this is important because it ties it back into the story that many, many people have heard, which is that soldiers were injured and even killed looking for Bowe Bergdahl. It's your contention that the government knew all along, the military knew all along, that he wasn't to be found there.
Yes.
He was in Pakistan.
Yes.
And that those soldiers, as you put it, were heroes in their own right, and that they were misled.
They were absolutely misled, and they have a right to be angry. I just think some of their anger at Bowe Bergdahl perhaps is misplaced when it was their own chain of command that was misleading them. And throughout those months, men were sent on missions to go find Bowe Bergdahl when he wasn't there. And soldiers who were on those missions, it became a catch-22. They said to us, we did our best to find him even when we knew he wasn't there.
You talked to soldiers, as you just mentioned. You talked to military brass. You talked to the parents of Bowe Bergdahl. How important were those conversations to the book?
Hugely. The book is a testament to our sources. Sources were people, some of them whistleblowers, who had their own professional troubles when they decided to go on the record in Congress, and some of them were retired brass who talked to us, Michael Mullen and Chuck Hagel, who talked to us because they thought it was important to set the record straight on a story that had been turned into a political football so quickly and exploited so quickly, and his family and the community in Haley immediately turned into traitors with no evidence for political reasons. And I think a lot of our sources, including the high-ranking ones and former military, wanted to talk because, as one of them put it, I just didn't like the way it smelled. I just didn't like the way it looked.
How important were the interviews with Bowe Bergdahl's parents to your story?
Hugely important. And we're very, very grateful for them. It took a lot of courage after what they had been through to finally speak up and share what is truly an incredible story. I mean, they saw the behind the curtain of the U.S. military machine and national security apparatus in a way that very few Americans have the opportunity to.
Do you think that having access to the parents in any way biased you or swayed you to their point of view?
Well, you worked as a journalist to maintain objectivity, but when his parents had been cast in such a harsh, specific light and in such egregious ways as Taliban sympathizers, which did not seem possible, no, I think what it did was it humanized them. Getting to know them humanized them and explained what any human being would do and any parent would do when their child was in such an awful condition.
You did not talk with Bowe Bergdahl himself. Did you try?
We tried. He was, by the time we were in touch with him, we would see him at his court-martial, but he was under pretty smart legal advice to stop talking to media.
Because he had talked to media. Many people have probably heard the podcast Serial, in which Hollywood producers' tapes were used. Mark Boal, you're pretty critical of that series and of those tapes being released.
We are. I think those tapes ended up hurting Bowe in his legal case, and it was very questionable timing to have them released before the Army had made its decision about the kind of court-martial he was even going to have, and then to have those tapes air and to have Bowe self-criminate while the legal process was going on, I think is questionable. And I think, but this is also the way Hollywood works, and I think it shows the way that Bowe Bergdahl was exploited at every turn by any interest that could exploit him. He was exploited by the Taliban. He was exploited then upon his return by the White House that wanted to show this as a great triumph. He was then exploited by Republicans who wanted to show this as a great screw up. And then he was even exploited by Hollywood in an attempt to sensationalize his story.
What did Bowe Bergdahl actually do, and what was he thinking he could do?
Bowe was not of a clear mindset, and certainly was not of the emotional demeanor of someone who should be on the front lines in Afghanistan. It's worth going back to what we said earlier. He washed out of the Coast Guard with an emotional breakdown, and the Coast Guard did its job and did the paperwork that said if Bowe Bergdahl should never re-enlist in the United States military without treatment, counseling, and a mental health screening. Well, the Army provided waivers and just papered over all of that and took him anyway. So it's important to acknowledge at the beginning that Bowe Bergdahl has a unique way of thinking, which has been diagnosed as schizotypal personality disorder, which is something that the psychiatrist described as schizophrenia light. So it's not a full break with reality, but it's not a clear understanding of what's going on around him and the impacts that most soldiers would have. At the same time, let me talk a little bit about what he was trying to do and think. He became convinced that their commanding officer was not just incompetent, but insane, and was going to send him and his platoon on a suicide mission. And he became convinced that his friends and fellow platoon mates were going to be killed for this man's vanity. That's probably not true. That's probably an overestimation of the facts based on Bowe's own unclear way of analyzing what was going on around him. But what he did was he tried to walk to a nearby base to get the attention of a general and to alert the chain of command that he thought his own chain of command was needed to be reprimanded and dealt with.
Let's talk about what happened to Bowe Bergdahl in his, 5 years? 5 years of...
nearly 5 years.
Nearly 5 years of...
4 years and 11 months, I think. Immediately upon his capture, he began his escape attempts, and he never stopped his escape attempts. And he got away a couple times. So when they saw that this fast-running, strong U.S. soldier was going to keep running, they decided to chain him to a bed frame, spread eagle, where they kept him for 3 months in order to atrophy his muscles so that he would not be able to run again. And while he was on that bed, he was tortured in a variety of ways. So when he ultimately escaped for his longest escape, he escaped for 9 days, and he was wandering around. And at one point in our book, readers will learn the story of when he heard drones overhead, and he knew that there were people thousands of miles away watching camera footage live on the ground where he stood in Pakistan, and he had no way to get their attention. And it's just this incredible gap. But he was eventually recaptured by his Taliban captors, and at that point, they built a cage that he lived in for more than 3 years. It was the worst treatment and torture, as a Pentagon debriefer testified in one of his hearings that any US POW had had since Vietnam. That same debriefer during his testimony choked up emotionally when he described what Bergdahl had been through and that he never gave up. And that while we can say that what he did was in his act of leaving his base was stupid and indefensible, at the same time it must be acknowledged that he is not a traitor. He did not go looking for the Taliban. There's no evidence for either of those charges. And while he was in captivity, he never stopped trying to escape and never stopped trying to gather intelligence, which he then brought back and gave to the Pentagon and the FBI and the alphabet soup of agencies that debriefed him, which was some of the most useful intelligence that they received about Western Pakistan during the entire war. Bo described places, and within weeks we ramped up drone attacks and taking out Al-Qaeda, Taliban, and Haqqani hideouts at a really fast clip.
Ultimately, Bo Bergdahl was released in a very controversial prisoner exchange. You've called President Trump's comments about Bo Bergdahl as a practice run for disinformation. What do you mean by a practice run for disinformation?
So researchers at Clemson University have analyzed some of the memes that came out in that week after Bo was released that showed in very scary ways him and his father in the Rose Garden looking and describing them as Islamic terrorists. And those memes have been traced back, several of them, to the Internet Research Agency in St. Petersburg, Russia. This was in the middle of 2014. It was further acknowledged that the controversy in Twin Falls surrounding the immigration issues there were Facebook acknowledged were a result of Facebook ads purchased by the Russian government or intelligence services. So what we mean is Bergdahl became an early practice for what then defined so much of our politics now. So much of our politics now is defined by this misinformation and propaganda disseminated through social media. Our enemies have found a way to turn our own tools of freedom of expression against us. And the Bergdahl story was a good initial test run of that worked. And the president was aware it worked, who's now the president. He wasn't the president then, but he saw in the Bergdahl story something he could latch onto and sensationalize. And of course, what's tragic about it, and what struck so many people who we interviewed in the United States military, is that those messages that Donald Trump was saying in 2014 that Bergdahl was a traitor were originally Taliban propaganda messages themselves. So we are using, to score political points in our own system, we're using our enemies' talking points against ourselves. Americans were encouraged to hate their fellow Americans without having all the facts. And I think why people will enjoy reading our book is to learn just how big the gap is between the political entertainment that is on cable news and the reality of what's happening.
Bo Bergdahl ultimately pled guilty
Yes.
to the charges against him, and as I understand from reading your book, that was kind of against his attorney's advice. Why do you think he did that? I know you can't get inside his head, but
yeah. Well, the defense believed and had an argument that he didn't desert. He was AWOL for 24 hours when he was captured, because a desertion implies an intent to leave for good. And he did not intend that. He intended to return that next day. So I think they knew that was going to be a very difficult trial, and they saw that the government, when the government, whether it's the military or civilian cases, want to railroad an individual in this system with classification, they can do that. And they probably saw that this was going to be a very difficult trial, and if the government could manipulate all of the information through classification, perhaps he was going to lose, and he was facing life in prison, back in a cage after the time he had served as a captive.
And they were going to use the argument as well of mental illness.
Yes, and they did, and
he didn't potentially want that label.
That's right. He didn't want this to be a insanity plea. He despite what he went through, and despite what the psychiatrist said about how he was thinking, Bo Bergdahl remained true to his own self and remained true. He knew it was a mistake. He didn't defend it himself. He told the general that this was, quote, a fantastic idea. He called himself ignorant looking back on what he had done. And he pled guilty to it, and I think he decided that he was going to throw himself at the mercy of the court and of the judge, and that the judge would be fair.
Where's Bo Bergdahl today?
I don't actually know. He's under advice not to, he needs to remain under the radar, and the people who do know where he is are certainly not talking about it, and he's just trying to get on with his life from what I understand.
So he doesn't visit Haley and his parents?
Not from what I know.
What did you, I should ask you, what most surprised you about doing this research and writing the book?
Well, I wouldn't say it was a surprise as much as a reassurance, but we just met so many good people. And this story sounds like such a bad story about institutions and American institutions doing such bad things and behaving so badly. So it was really a good surprise to find that in the military legal system, officers, soldiers, how many people are people of integrity and people trying to do the right thing by this country, by the Army, and it's the political influence and the political dysfunction in Washington that so often causes things like this case to blow up into what it did.
If you could talk to Bo Bergdahl, what would you want to know? What would you want to ask him?
I think I'd like to ask him what he imagined the war that he was going to go fight was about, and what he thinks after all this time the war has accomplished, and what his role in it and in history will be. And
what's next for you? Are you going to continue this foray into book publishing or reporting?
Oh yeah, I mean, I'm a reporter. I think I can't help it. I like asking questions. I like knowing the story behind the headlines, and I think it's important, especially at this time, that we all keep asking questions, and I plan to do the same.
So, anything you want to divulge about what you're working on?
I'll be working on the Afghan peace talks, and I'm researching a number of other topics, but
not at liberty to discuss.
Yeah, to be determined.
Well, thank you very much for taking the time to talk about your book, American Cipher, and I look forward to seeing what else you write in the future.
Thanks, Marcia. Thanks for having me.
That's all the time we have. You've been listening to Michael Ames, a former Idaho reporter and the author of American Cipher, Bo Bergdahl and the U.S. Tragedy in Afghanistan. For more information, check out the Dialogue website. Just go to idahoptv.org and click on Dialogue. For Dialogue, I'm Marcia Franklin. Thanks for joining us.
Presentation of Dialogue on Idaho Public Television is made possible through the generous support of the Laura Moore Cunningham Foundation, committed to fulfilling the Moore and Bettis family legacy of building the great state of Idaho. By the Friends of Idaho Public Television and by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. Check out our website, become a friend on Facebook, or follow us on Twitter.